Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. March 3rd, 1944. East Anglia, England. Imagine the lamplight pooling over a small desk as Lieutenant William Overstreet presses a pencil to paper, a faint tremor in his fingers born of fatigue, not fright. He writes to his sweetheart in Virginia and lets slip a confession. Tomorrow they will attempt what the wise head swore could not be done, Berlin, and back in a single-seat fighter. The senior officers had insisted it was fantasy. Yet, through the barracks window, he can't ignore the proof under the floodlights. Ground crews fastening odd cylindrical bulges beneath the wings of his P-51 Mustang. They look almost homemade new fuel tanks that resemble parcels from the post, brown and humble like something wrapped on a kitchen table. Some of the men have already given them a nickname, paper bags. When Overstreet voices his doubts, the crew chief only grins. Laminated paper with plastic resin, Lieutenant. The same kind the Brits have been flying, long enough to take you there and bring you back. And so the arithmetic of air war is about to be reworked, not by bigger guns or exotic alloys, but by compressed paper soaked in resin, turned out in a converted newspaper plant by workers who, in peacetime, print the London Times. The road to this moment has a date burned into memory. October 14th, 1943, Black Thursday. Picture Colonel Hubert Zemker at Halesworth, fixed before the operations board as the mission reports arrive like telegrams from a battlefield no one can see. 60 BA-17 gone, 600 men lost in a single day. Out of 291 B-17 flying fortresses dispatched against the ball-bearing works at Schweinfurt, 60 are ripped from the sky by fighters in flak, and 17 more returned so mutilated they must be scrapped. More than 26% of the attacking force erased. How long can daylight bombing persist when it bleeds this freely without fighter escort over Germany? Among those who do make it home to Thorpe Abbotts is Technical Sergeant Robert Morgan, crouched hours earlier in the cramped sphere of a B-17's ball turret with the 100th Bomb Group. In the intelligence debrief, his words are blunt. The Jerrys waited until our little friends turned back at Aachen, then they rolled in wave after wave. Head-on passes and rockets from twin-engine ships loitering just beyond our guns. For 3 hours, we were targets nailed to the sky. The P-47 Thunderbolt's magnificent machines, though they are, can only stretch to roughly 375 miles with their standard drop tanks. The Luftwaffe has learned to linger just past that invisible boundary and then rake the bomber streams with clinical, almost clockwork precision. Now, shift your gaze to a modest office at the 8th Air Force Technical Section in Bovingdon, where Colonel Cass Howe studies an object that could be mistaken for schoolroom handiwork rather than a weapon of strategy. It is a fuel tank fashioned from laminated craft paper, impregnated with plastic resin, the handiwork of Bowater Lloyd of London, the same firm that usually feeds Fleet Street with newsprint. Ho has spent months worrying this unorthodox answer to the range problem into being working alongside British engineers already tinkering with non-metallic drop tanks and in concert with Colonel Bob Schaefer. The British imperative began with scarcity. Metal stocks were perilously thin, every pound of aluminum a treasure, but Howe perceives a bonus beyond conservation. These paper tanks tip the scale at about 50 pounds empty versus 150 for their metal cousins. That difference converts cleanly and mercilessly into more fuel, and with it, the range needed to change the map of the war. Picture the workshop smell of glue and sawdust, layer on layer of craft paper bonded with resorcinol formaldehyde adhesive, laid over wooden forms with internal wooden anti-slosh baffles like ribs inside a ship's hull. Then came the armor fuel-resistant lacquer and a coat of aluminum paint that gave each tank its unmistakable silver sheen. This was not a child's art project. It was engineering with a battlefield deadline. The first trial by fire arrived in February 1944. P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group took to the air with British-built 108-gallon paper tanks slung beneath their wings. Major James Goodson led the formation, and in his combat report afterward, noted with the calm of a test pilot and the relief of a survivor that the tanks behaved perfectly, Hanover and back, no leaks, no failures, granting an extra 125 miles of reach. A modest increment on paper, a door kicked open in practice. But you know how it goes in war. One success invites a bigger gamble. That gamble materialized at Debden late that same month with the arrival of the P-51B Mustang. Colonel Donald Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group, its 334th, 335th, and 336th Squadrons logged their first Mustangs on February 28th. The pilots had scarcely a day to convert from their Thunderbolts. Imagine climbing into a new steed with the clock pounding in your ears. Captain Don Gentile, destined to rank among the war's premier aces, tallied exactly 45 minutes in the Mustang before strapping in for his first combat hop. What would you have felt facing that runway with less than an hour in type? Yet the real alchemy was the pairing of this airframe with those paper drop tanks, a union that would tilt the axis of the air war. The Mustang could carry 2 of the 108-gallon tanks, now pouring off the lines at Boltwater Lloyd plants in Sittingbourne and Kemsley. With both tanks aboard, the P-51's combat radius stretched to roughly 850 miles. Do the math with me. Berlin sits about 580 miles from East Anglia. Suddenly, the map that once said, "Here be dragons," now read, "Within reach." Can you feel the boundary move? At Debden, the morning briefing on March 4, 1944, crackled with a tension you could taste. Intelligence Officer Major John McAlpin swept back the curtain on the mission board, and a single red ribbon ran like an artery from base to Berlin. For the first time in military history, single-engine fighters would escort heavy bombers to the enemy's capital and bring them home again. A round trip of 1,100 miles, more than a line on a map. It was a pivot in the very strategy of daylight bombing. Years later, Captain William O'Brien of the 357th Fighter Group could still hear the room. Silence so sharp you could hear a pin strike concrete, then a low whistle. Berlin. We were going all the way to Berlin in fighters. Out on the hard stand, the crew chiefs had been feeding gasoline into those paper tanks since 0300 hours. It was careful work, almost ceremonial. They knew the chemistry. The tanks would hold fuel for about 5 hours before the gasoline began to attack the resin. But 5 hours was enough. Enough to cross that invisible line, enough to throw a shadow over Berlin, enough to rewrite what a single-seat escort could do. Do not let the word paper fool you. The design hid its sophistication in plain sight. Each tank was built in 3 principal sections: nose cone, tail cone, and body. The center barrel was formed by wrapping layers of impregnated paper around a cylinder. The end caps were hand-laminated from petal-shaped pieces known as gauze, fitted like a craftsman's tessellation. Capacity, 108 U.S. Gallons of 100-octane aviation fuel, sometimes cataloged as 110 total with 108 usable. Each tank stretched 100 inches end to end and had to pass a pressure test up to 6 psi. They shrugged off extremes operable from sea level to 40,000 feet, from minus 60 to plus 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Would you have expected such resilience from something born in a paper mill? As 1944 rolled on, production swelled. At WWII, many workers, women who had once turned out newspapers, and in other facilities, including dispersed cottage industry shops and British homes and workshops, the tanks multiplied. Assembly lines met kitchen tables, and the war effort threaded itself through everyday life. Yet in America, skepticism held fast even as the skies over Europe offered contrary evidence. Technical voices at Wright Field declared the concept absolutely unfeasible and unfit for its intended purpose. But by the time that verdict crossed the Atlantic, the 8th Air Force had already hung more than 15,000 paper tanks under its fighters without a single failure laid at the feet of tank construction. Colonel Hough's answer was as blunt as a rivet gun: keep building, keep flying. The ledger of combat speaks louder than any laboratory memo. When facts stack up in formation, doubt loses altitude. And then came the day itself. On March 4th, P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts formed up with over 700 heavy bombers for the first escort all the way to Berlin. Colonel Blakesley led the Mustangs, his pre-mission words captured by intelligence officer Captain John Slater: "These paper tanks will get you there and back. When you hit the initial point, punch them off and engage any enemy fighters. Remember, with these tanks, we own the sky all the way to Berlin. Not a boast so much as a promise paid for in metal and nerve." The mission took its toll. The 4th Fighter Group lost Lieutenant Alan Bunty to flak near Brandenburg. Still, beyond the hard arithmetic of casualties, the psychological shock echoed on both sides. Imagine looking up from the streets of Berlin or the dispersal at Debden and realizing the horizon itself had been redrawn. Under a blacked-out sky, Oberleutnant Heinz Knucker of Jagdgeschwader 11 opened his diary and tried to reconcile sight with doctrine. American fighters over Berlin. Could that be real? His pen stabbed at the page as he recorded the shock. Their intelligence had sworn this was impossible. What they had been told was wrong. Can you imagine the jolt, as if the map itself had slipped under his feet? For the bomber crews, the vision was more than startling. It was deliverance. Picture yourself in a B-17's belly with Sergeant Dale Rice of the 100th Bomb Group, cramped in the ball turret and watching the sky ahead thicken near the initial point. At 30,000 feet, the contrails lay like chalk strokes across a slate, and up there, P-51s. One Mustang dipped its wings as it crossed overhead, the drop tanks playing under each wing. What would that gesture have felt like to you? An assurance? A vow? The effect rippled instantly through the formation, and the message landed just as fast with the enemy. On March 6th, when the bombers came back to Berlin with Mustang escort, Luftwaffe interceptions fell off sharply. Major Walter Nowotny, 258 victories to his name, reported to High Command that the Americans had solved the range problem. The advantage, he warned, had slipped away. Now step behind the factory doors where this shift began. The paper tank production line became a case study in Allied ingenuity and shared effort. Bowater Lloyd, the firm that had supplied 60% of Britain's newsprint before the war, carved out capacity at Sittingbourne and Kemsley to build tanks instead of headlines. Their mastery of paper lamination and their steady supply streams made the fit almost uncanny. The kraft paper, drawn from recycled newspapers and packaging. The adhesive resorcinol formaldehyde came from Imperial Chemical Industries, made with inputs that didn't steal from other wartime priorities. From raw stock to finished, silver-painted tank took about 72 hours. And it didn't stop at the big plants. Distributed manufacturing spread across Britain. Home workshops joined the chain, turning kitchens and sheds into annexes of the front. Wrapped in heavy brown paper for shipment, the tanks packed tight. Far more paper units could be flown than their metal counterparts, multiplying reach with every load. On the receiving end stood the logistics crews who turned crates into combat range. Master Sergeant Donald Marner of the 357th Fighter Group, overseeing drop tank operations at Leicester, left meticulous records that survived the war. Imagine his team at 200 hours on mission days, knives and checklists in hand unwrap, inspect, seal, mount. The attachment system was elegantly straightforward. The tanks latched onto standard bomb shackles with a quick release. One pull of a cockpit lever and both tanks fell away together. Vital when a dogfight demanded a clean, agile airplane. Fuel plumbing used what the aircraft already carried. Check valves snapped shut the instant the tanks were gone, keeping precious fuel where it belonged. There was a catch that everyone respected. Gasoline would slowly gnaw at the resorcinol bonds, so time mattered. Fill them just before takeoff, fly them once, and treat them as strictly single-use. By May 1944, the scoreboard told the story in cold numbers. Before long-range escort, the 8th Air Force loss picture was grim. October 1943 ran at roughly a 7.6% monthly loss rate, with single nightmares like Black Thursday spiking to about 20.6% on a mission. Then the P-51s with drop tanks began to ride shotgun as a matter of course. The overall campaign loss rate fell into the 1.5 to 2.2% range. Do you feel the weight of that decline? Thousands of aircrew lives preserved, and with them, the very sustainability of daylight strategic bombing. Engineers, too, found surprises in the paper. Republic aviation analysts discovered that the tanks didn't just weigh less. They slipped through the air more cleanly than many metal designs shaving drag. Under fire, they brought another quiet advantage. Instead of fragmenting into shrapnel, the paper and resin skins tended to tear. And when a mission ended, the landscape breathed easier. The tanks were partly biodegradable, softening back into the earth within months if left in fields or forests. Unlike metal carcasses that lingered as hazards to farm and plow. Now, climb into the cockpit with Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer, who had finished the war with 24 aerial victories. His combat report from March 6th, preserved in the National Archives, reads like a time-stamped heartbeat of the mission. Takeoff at 10:45 hours with 2 108-gallon paper drop tanks. Fuel transfer, flawless, start to finish. At 13:47 hours near Wittenberg, bounced by FW-19's tanks released on the instant and into the fight. Feel that lurch as the weight peels away? The aircraft leapt in response, performance surging the moment the tanks fell, the Mustang suddenly all muscle and edge. If you had been there, hand tight on the throttle, would you have felt the same thing Meyer did, range transmuted into speed, protection into power, and a simple paper invention rewriting the limits of war in real time? He flamed one FW-190, scarred another, and brought his Mustang home with 45 gallons still in the tanks. His verdict was crisp. Without the paper drops, they would have turned back at Brunswick. Do you hear the implication? Those silver packages didn't just carry fuel, they carried the difference between retreat and reach. and reach changed everything. With the leash lengthened, American fighters were no longer tied to close cover. They could range deep into Germany on fighter sweeps, pouncing on airfields, scything through rail yards, striking whatever targets of opportunity revealed themselves. In May 1944, Colonel Hub Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group set down a tactical assessment that cut to the core. The added range delivered by British paper tanks had fundamentally recast the air war, shifting the initiative wholly to Allied hands. Imagine the relief of acting rather than reacting, of setting the tempo rather than dancing to it. The Germans knew it too, and their own paperwork betrays that recognition. A technical intelligence report from Messerschmitt AG, dated May 15, 1944, admitted that the enemy was employing disposable fuel tanks of revolutionary build laminated paper impregnated with phenolic resin. They tried to mirror the design, but ran into a wall not of theory, but of capacity. Their war economy was a patchwork under strain. Paper mills were largely diverted to military maps and documentation. Resin stocks were earmarked for aircraft structures, and, most decisive of all, they lacked the distributed manufacturing web that made Allied production resilient and fast. The blueprint wasn't the problem, the system was. At the top of the Luftwaffe, the implications were grasped with grim clarity. Post-war interrogations confirm as much. While the tidy, oft-repeated line ascribed to Hermann Göring about seeing Mustangs over Berlin cannot be pinned to primary sources. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey records his statement that long-range Allied fighters dealt a major strategic blow to German planning, one of the most decisive factors in how events ultimately turned. He conceded that when fighters appeared over Berlin, the outcome for Germany would be, in his own word, tragic. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland echoed the point. American fighters roving anywhere over Germany, virtually at will, shattered the Luftwaffe's defensive concept. Ask yourself, what happens to a shield when the sword can reach every inch behind it? By June 1944, paper drop tanks had become standard issue for fighter ops. The ledgers tell their own story. Sergeant James Patterson, a quartermaster at Duxford, kept logistics records showing that paper tanks consumed only 1/10 the shipping volume of metal tanks. A single C-47 could ferry hundreds of flattened paper tanks, where it could carry about 40 metal ones. The result? After D-Day, forward fields in France could be supplied by air alone, keeping the sortie rate high even when roads and depots groaned under the strain. There was a postscript the era barely noticed, but farmers remembered. Metal tanks strewn across fields could kill cattle, snap plows, and demand years of cleanup. Paper tanks, by contrast, slumped back into the soil rain working on them through the winter, leaving only the metal fittings, which could be salvaged for scrap. Not a wartime intention, but an accidental mercy all the same. Even so, nothing is flawless. Captain Donald Bryan of the 352nd Fighter Group experienced one of the rare failures on July 18, 1944, the only documented case in his squadron. Over Hanover at 25,000 feet, his port tank began to leak, bleeding roughly half its fuel before he could shut it down. He still made it home, sustained by the starboard tank, a quiet demonstration of the system's built-in redundancy, and the engineering didn't stand still. Through 1944, the design marched forward. Second-generation paper tanks incorporated improved resin formulations, stretching safe fuel storage time from 5 hours to 12. That single change mattered. Crews could prep the night before, easing the pre-dawn crush and smoothing the launch rhythm. More time in the schedule meant more control in the air range transmuted into tempo, logistics into leverage. Isn't that how wars are won? Piece by ingenious piece? Cold bit like wire at altitude, but the tanks had learned to live there. Improved cold weather treatment kept fuel lines from freezing in the thin, bitter air. And then came the great test of everything those silver packages had made possible. June 6, 1944. D-Day did not just unveil an armada. It revealed how thoroughly drop tanks had remade the battle's geometry. Fighter bombers, wearing paper tanks under their wings, pushed far inland to harry German reinforcements hundreds of miles from the beaches. Captain Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group flew 3 sorties that day, each time relying on paper tanks to loiter over the invasion front, ready to pounce. Imagine looking down from that orbit columns on the move, crossroads to choke, bridges to cut, and knowing you could stay. Continuous fighter cover over the beaches and deep into France became not a hope but a routine, and that constancy proved vital to Overlord's success. The numbers behind the curtain told the scale. By mid-1944, British factories were turning out paper drop tanks by the thousands each month, Bowater Lloyd as the anchor, other facilities adding muscle. The result? The entire Allied fighter force in Northern Europe could bolt on fresh tanks for every mission. Metal tanks could not keep pace. Aluminum was a rationed lifeblood, demanded first by aircraft production. Paper solved the bottleneck with pulp and resin. Tactics and triumphs stacked up accordingly. Colonel Francis Gabreski, the European theater's leading ace with 28 victories, flew his most successful mission on July 5, 1944, with paper tanks aboard. He led the 61st Fighter Squadron toward Magdeburg, then punched off his tanks near Brandenburg and shot down 3 Messerschmitt Bf-10-9s. His report reads like a checklist of validation. Perfect tank performance at 30,000 feet despite minus 40-degree cold. Clean release when bounced by enemy fighters. And the instant the weight fell away, a decisive jump in climb rate. Can you feel that surge? The airplane suddenly taut and eager, like a hound slipped from the leash? By September 1944, the Luftwaffe day fighter arm was effectively shattered. General Adolf Galland told Hitler plainly, American fighters were ranging over all of Germany with impunity. Long-range escort had done more than shield the bombers. Relentless fighter sweeps had dismantled the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground. Training pipelines, pushed into scattered fields to evade attack, could not build skill fast enough. German programs were graduating pilots with fewer than 50 hours, while American trainees logged around 400. What chance does doctrine have when experience itself is forced into retreat? Consider First Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 3I-61 Fighter Group on October 7, 1944. With 2 108-gallon paper tanks, he shepherded bombers to Politz, near the Polish border, about 1,400 miles out and back. After dropping his tanks, he downed 2 Me-262 jets, among the first to fell Germany's revolutionary fighters. Range begat presence, presence begat opportunity, and opportunity, seized in a single heartbeat, rewrote the headlines. Logistics remained a quiet hero, especially when winter pressed in. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, forward strips sprang up overnight and supply lines went taut as piano wire. Paper tanks, light and compact, could be flown in by small aircraft or even dropped by parachute. Captain Jack Ilfrey, commanding the 20th Fighter Group, recorded a surge day on December 23rd. 3 missions, each one with fresh paper tanks. Ground crews turning birds around rearm, refuel, remount in 20 minutes. Imagine that choreography in the cold. Wrenches, hoses, latches, a slam of a palm against a pylon go. The enemy studied, measured, and admitted what they found. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, a German technical intelligence officer captured in April 1945, told U.S. interrogators that they tracked every increment of Allied fighter capability, and the arrival of paper drop tanks ranked above any new aircraft type in strategic effect. The meaning was chillingly simple. Nowhere in the Reich lay beyond fighter reach. Their air defense concept, concentric rings of bases, was obsolete the instant range erased distance. Strategy's ledger agreed. The Strategic Bombing Survey's figures were stark. In 1943, before long-range escort became routine, German fighter output could rise in spite of bombing. By late 1944, with Mustangs prowling over every factory, fighter production fell by 40%. More fatal still, fuel production collapsed by 90%, stranding even those fighters that rolled off the lines. What good is a blade when the scabbard is empty? Operators, too, knew the truth in their bones. Lieutenant Colonel John Landers of the 78th Fighter Group flew 103 combat missions, many with paper tanks. In testimony given to Air Force historians in 1962, he called the paper drop tank the Air War's unsung hero, simple, cheap, indispensable. Without those British tanks, escort to Berlin would have been impossible. Without that escort, the Luftwaffe would never have been broken. Do you hear the verdict? Sometimes the war winner isn't the glamour machine. It's the humble enabler that lets the glamour machine arrive. The ripple effects reached into peacetime. Techniques forged for paper tanks did not evaporate with victory. The lamination processes migrated into civilian aircraft parts and, in time, broader aerospace. Quality control standards codified at Bowater Lloyd became patterns for British industry. Workers trained in precise paper construction spun up firms that built everything from aircraft interior panels to architectural components, new livelihoods born from wartime craft. From the cockpit, the memory remained personal and pointed. Major Richard Turner of the 356th Fighter Group wrote in his 1946 memoir that the paper tanks were their passports to Berlin, ridiculous to look at, flawless in service. He flew 89 missions with paper tanks and never suffered a single failure. Even Soviet observers attached to 8th Air Force units took note and reported the innovation back to Moscow. Picture that. Across languages and ideologies, one idea was legible to all. The simplest path to victory, at 30,000 feet, might just be written on paper. In 1945, Colonel Ivan Kozhedub, the Soviet Union's top ace-put, captured German drop tanks through their paces and set them beside the American paper versions. His verdict was disarmingly clear. The American tanks won on every count, not because of exotic technology, but because of brilliant simplicity. Isn't that the secret history of so many wartime breakthroughs, the elegant answer that hides in plain sight? As the Allies drove for the Rhine and beyond, production surged to match ambition. For the final offensive into Germany, every fighter sortie went out with fresh tanks. At forward bases in Belgium and Holland, ground crews could outfit entire fighter groups in hours, not days. Picture that tempo. Pallets cracked open, fittings checked, pylons armed, an industrial heartbeat pushing air power ever deeper. Lieutenant Robert Powell of the 55th Fighter Group faced the ultimate proof of reliability on March 24, 1945, Operation Varsity, the Rhine crossing. Wheels up at or 600 with two 108-gallon paper tanks. He reached the river, jettisoned when Me-26 bounced him near Frankfurt, fought 15 minutes, then dropped into a forward strip, took on new tanks, and launched again. Flexibility and endurance, stitched together by paper and resin. Could there be a cleaner demonstration of a system doing exactly what it was built to do? The final large-scale use of paper drop tanks in the European theater came on April 25, 1945, when Mustangs escorted reconnaissance aircraft to Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. A round trip of about 400 miles, flown with the calm assurance of total air dominance, fighters roaming the farthest corners of the Reich without opposition. Think of the message that sent. The map's edges no longer mattered. From Italy, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., leading the 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen, made the same arithmetic work in the South. In his after-action report of March 31, 1945, he wrote that 108-gallon paper tanks let them escort bombers to Munich and fight throughout the mission, performing flawlessly above 30,000 feet. Those simple tanks gave them the range to prove conclusively what they were capable of as fighter pilots. The psychological echo reached the streets. Captured letters and diaries tell of civilians staring up at American fighters overhead again and again, watching paper fuel tanks thump into parks and avenues, tokens, they thought, of such abundance that the enemy could carry gasoline in paper containers and throw them away. What does that do to morale when even the trash looks like proof of superiority? After the guns went quiet, the Pentagon's accounting drew neat lines under the strategy. Savings in aluminum alone justified the program. Reduced shipping costs, simplified logistics, fewer ground crew hours, all of it multiplied the payoff. Most vital of all, the extended range of the escorts saved an estimated 8,000 bomber crew lives, pulling loss rates back from the catastrophic ravine of late 1943 to sustainable levels by early 1944. Numbers, at last, speaking the language of mercy. Even skeptics took stock. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, who had doubted the premise of daylight bombing, acknowledged in his memoirs that the American feet-stretching fighter range with disposable tanks validated the whole strategic concept. And General James Doolittle, in his final report as commander of the 8th Air Force, put the stamp on it. Extending fighter range through auxiliary tanks, especially the British-manufactured paper tanks, was the single most important tactical development of the air war in Europe. It turned the P-51 from a fine fighter into a war-winning weapon system. The capacity to accompany bombers to any target in Germany broke the Luftwaffe's back and secured the Allied air supremacy that victory required. Do not forget the hands that made it possible. The human story lives on the factory floor. At Sittingbourne, production ran on 3 shifts to keep pace, and 70% of the workforce were women craftspeople of precision paper and resin who built, by the thousands, the humble devices that redrew a continent's skies. If you stood with them in that clatter and glue-scented air, would you have guessed that victory could be cut, layered, and laminated sheet by patient sheet until it flew? They understood, shift after weary shift, that every tank they turned out might mean an Allied air crew could fly farther and come home safer. And the numbers behind that hope were astonishing for devices that looked so humble. Each 108-gallon tank could endure 3 Gs of acceleration when full and 9 Gs when empty. They worked flawlessly across brutal temperature swings and at the highest operational altitudes, fuel transfer rates matched the aircraft's internal systems, so the handoff in combat felt seamless to the pilot. No stutter, no pause, just continuity of power. All of this from compressed paper and plastic resin materials any industrial nation could source, married to uniquely Anglo-American ingenuity and the will to produce at scale. German aircraft designer Willy Messerschmitt, questioned after the war, conceded that they understood auxiliary tanks and used them, but never envisioned mass-producing disposable tanks from non-strategic materials. The Americans and British instead turned a logistics headache into a production advantage. Doctrine shifted with it. The United States Air Force enshrined long-range fighter escort as a foundational principle, shaping aircraft design through the Cold War and beyond. The very idea of disposable add-ons to stretch capability, fuel tanks, sensor pods, weapons pylons, became standard practice. The paper tank proved a larger truth. You don't always need exotic materials or revolutionary tech. Sometimes victory is the creative recombination of what's already at hand. Lieutenant General William Kepner, who commanded the 8th Fighter Command, captured the essence in 1946 congressional testimony. The paper drop tank gave us air superiority over Europe. Without it, our bombers would have continued to suffer prohibitive losses. Without it, our fighters couldn't have hunted the Luftwaffe to extinction. Without it, D-Day might have failed. Strong words, and borne out not only in strategy, but in the landscape itself. The environmental story, overlooked then, was real. Roughly 15,000 paper tanks dropped over Europe broke down within months, while metal tanks lingered as hazards. French agricultural reports from 1946 recorded no lasting soil contamination from paper tanks, whereas fields littered with metal versions demanded heavy cleanup that dragged into the 1950s. Meanwhile, the quality control breakthroughs forged for a disposable product with zero tolerance for failure spread worldwide. The demand for absolute reliability drove the adoption of statistical process control across industries. And an important mindset took hold. Simple, good enough solutions could outperform over-engineered alternatives, cutting costs without sacrificing trust in the result. The strategic echoes carried into the post-war years. During the Berlin airlift of 1948, transport aircraft used disposable tanks derived from wartime paper tank know-how to stretch their legs. In Korea, F-51 Mustangs flying from Japan employed improved versions. The technology matured into modern composites, yet the core idea, lightweight, expendable range extension, remained unchanged. Back in 1945, the final wartime chapter closed almost at the bell. On May 7th, one day before VE Day, Mustangs of the 357th Fighter Group flew a last combat patrol over Czechoslovakia. Lieutenant Robert Foy, on his 89th mission, logged 2 108-gallon paper tanks to Prague and back, jettisoning them over a farmer's field near Pilsen. In the decades that followed, reunions brought pilots and crew chiefs together to trade paper tank stories. At the 50th anniversary gathering at Duxford in 1995, former Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland stood before a displayed paper tank. Asked about the war's turning point in the air, he pointed to that unassuming cylinder and said it was the simple thing that meant they could never be safe, never rest, never rebuild. That the air war would knock at their door every day until there was nothing left to fly. Beneath that simplicity lay a deep craft, materials science, aerodynamics, production engineering, all braided together. Each tank embodied thousands of choices about paper grades, resin mixes, layup patterns, test thresholds, and inspection protocols. Success came from getting those choices right and then executing them at an unprecedented, relentless scale. Captain Lewis Curds of the 3rd Air Commando Group had the rare perspective of a man who fought wars on two fronts. Having flown Mustangs over both Europe and the Pacific, he could measure firsthand how one simple innovation bridged climates and continents. The same tanks that worked in European cold worked just as well in Pacific humidity, he noted later, marveling that good engineering, when done right, transcends the limits of weather, theater, or geography. And indeed, the legacy of the paper drop tank would ripple far beyond the runways of 1944. The phenolic resin, perfected for its construction, became the foundation of early printed circuit boards, the unseen skeleton of the coming electronics revolution. The heavy lamination presses once stamping out fuel tanks were repurposed in peacetime to make television cabinets for the booming consumer market of the 1950s. The men and women who had mastered precision paper construction turned that wartime skill into peacetime enterprise, founding firms that built aircraft interior panels, composite housings, even architectural facades. Wing Commander Peter Brothers, one of the RAF's most seasoned fighter leaders, watched American operations with quiet admiration and an edge of awe. They approached war like a business problem, he wrote. They bought range by the gallon in disposable containers. No romance, no elegance, only brutal efficiency. We gave them the idea, they gave it scale. Together, they gave the bombers safe passage to Berlin. The final audit came in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, a cool, meticulous summary of how ingenuity translated to dominance. The report concluded that auxiliary fuel tanks, especially the British-manufactured 108-gallon laminated paper type, had extended fighter escort range from 475 miles to 850 miles, a 79% increase. That leap brought every German target within reach. The effect was measurable in lives, roughly 8,000 Allied aircrew spared by the reduction in bomber losses. With full escort capability, the strategic bombing campaign finally achieved what doctrine had promised, but reality had long denied. Yet, beyond statistics lies a deeper truth. The paper drop tank tells us that modern warfare rarely turns on dazzling new inventions. It turns on the imaginative use of what already exists. A British paper company, American fighter planes, and a slurry of resin and compressed paper came together to break the Luftwaffe and secure Allied command of the skies. Around 15,000 of these tanks were built, dismissed at first as unworkable, later recognized as decisive. Everyone that worked perfectly meant a life saved, a mission completed, a step closer to victory. The bombers could finally strike their targets with constant protection. The fighters could chase the enemy home. And air superiority, so long a dream, was realized not by superior machines alone, but by superior reach, granted by what looked like oversized cardboard tubes, but carried within them the literal fuel for victory. Necessity had driven invention. With aluminum scarce and bombers dying, British resourcefulness met American manufacturing muscle and produced something so simple it seemed absurd until it changed the world. Paper and resin, newspaper presses and fighter wings, factory hands and frontline pilots, all threads of one vast solution to a deadly equation. And at its symbolic beginning stands Lieutenant William Overstreet, flying over Berlin on March 4, 1944, paper tanks slung under his P-51's wings. He couldn't have known that behind him stretched an invisible armada of unseen labor thousands of workers who would never set foot in combat, yet whose handiwork carried him there and brought him safely home. The story of the paper drop tank endures as proof of a timeless principle, that the most transformative advances often come not from complexity, but from clarity. When people, pressed by necessity, dare to see simplicity as strength